After 70, people start to disappear from your life. Not strangers, people you knew, people you sat beside for years, people who called themselves your friends, your neighbors, your close ones. They go quiet, the calls thin out, the visits stop, and the silence that replaces them has a particular quality. Not the silence of a quiet evening, but the silence of something that used to be there, no longer being there. And most of what gets written about this tries to make it gentle. It calls it natural. It calls it the season of life. It wraps it in soft language so the truth does not cut so hard. I am not going to do that. The truth is not cruel when it is honest. And the honest thing is this: most of the people who were close to you were never as close as you believed. Not because they were bad people. Because closeness built on circumstance is not the same thing as closeness built on choice. And after 70, the circumstances change. The job ends. The neighborhood shifts. The children grow and move. The things that held people near you for decades fall away. And when they fall away, so do the people who were only staying because of them. What is left is what was always real. That is not a tragedy. That is the sorting. And if you are willing to sit with me for a little while, I want to tell you what I have learned about the sorting, because I have watched it happen to people I loved. I have felt it happen in my own life, and I have come to understand that the disappearing is not the wound most people think it is. The wound is in not understanding what the disappearing means. So stay with me. If something in what I just said already touched something in you, say so in the comments. One word is enough. I read everything. My grandfather used to take me down to the river in the early mornings when I was young. We would sit on the bank before the light came fully up, and I would watch the water move. I asked him once why the river never ran dry, even though it was always losing water, losing it to the ground, to the air, to the places downstream I could not see. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. He said, "A river that stops losing water stops being a river. It becomes a pond, and a pond goes stagnant. A river is only alive because it is always releasing what is not meant to stay." I did not understand that until I was much older, but I have thought about it for 50 years, and I believe it is one of the most important things he ever taught me, because it is not just true of water, it is true of a life. There are people who come into your life because of where you are, not because of who you are. The coworker you spent 8 hours a day with for 20 years, you were thrown together by the same building, the same schedule, the same boss. Take the building away and what remains? The neighbor you wave to every morning, placed beside each other by something neither of you chose. The couple you socialized with because your children played together. The children grew, the children moved, and without them, what was left? Not a friendship that was chosen, a friendship that was assembled. And assembled friendships are not nothing. They carry real warmth, real moments that mattered, but they are borrowed. And borrowed things get returned eventually. After 70, the returning happens fast. The scaffolding of middle life, the job, the neighborhood, the children at home, the shared obligations, most of it comes down. And when it comes down, you see what was leaning against it and what was standing on its own. The people who were leaning on the scaffolding go with it, not because they are unkind, because they were always scaffolding people. They needed something to hold you both in place, and when that something went, they went with it. And the people who were standing on their own, the ones who chose you when they didn't have to, who came back when it was inconvenient, who called on a Tuesday for no reason at all, those people stay, not because the circumstances still demand it, because they decided you were worth staying for. And that deciding is everything. That is the whole difference. Most people spend the years after 70 grieving the ones who left. They write to me about it. The neighbor who disappeared, the old friend who stopped calling, the people they thought were close who turned out not to be. And I understand that grief. I have felt it myself. But almost no one spends enough time honoring the ones who stayed. Almost no one looks at who is still standing in the room after the scaffolding came down and says, there is what was real all along. That is what I want you to be able to do. That is what I want this conversation to give you today. I thought about this for a long time before I understood it, and the person who helped me understand it most was not someone who taught it to me directly. It was someone I watched, someone I had the privilege of watching for most of my life. My grandmother was a small woman, strong, quiet in the way that still things are quiet, not empty but full of something that did not need to make noise to be real. She raised 5 children. She buried 2. She outlived my grandfather by 11 years, and in all of those years, she never once spoke about her life as though it owed her something different than what it gave her. Every morning of her life, before the sun came fully up, she went outside, even in the cold, even in the deep cold of hard winters, when the ground was locked and the air would take your breath away. She breathed one slow, deep breath, and she said, quietly, almost under her breath, not performing it for anyone, she said, "Thank you for another one." And then she came back in, and she made the fire. I asked her once, I must have been 12 or 13, why she said thank you every morning, when so much of what had happened to her was hard. She had buried a child by then. She had known real grief. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table. She had a tin cup of something hot in her hands. I can still see it, the curl of steam, her small hands wrapped around the tin. She looked at me and she said, "Gratitude is not something you feel when life is good. It is something you practice when life is hard." She said it is a practice, not despite the effort, but because of it. The morning she said that to me was not long after she had buried her second child, my mother's younger brother. He was 37 years old. He had a wife and 2 small children. She had sat with that grief for months before I ever asked her about the mornings, and she had kept going outside. Every morning, one deep breath, thank you for another one. Not the absence of pain, the presence of something else alongside the pain. The choice, and it was always a choice, she made it every single morning, the choice to not let the grief be the only thing. Now I want to tell you the thing most people, in the middle of the disappearing, do not know how to hear. I want to say it plainly and let it land. The reason the people closest to you disappear after 70 is not because you have become less. It is not because you have done something wrong. The reason is simpler and more honest. Borrowed things get returned. The circumstances that held certain people near you for decades changed, and when they changed, those people went where their own circumstances took them. They were not lost, they were returned, because they were always borrowed. And the people who could not be returned, the ones who stayed without the circumstances making them, the ones who found a reason when all the easy reasons were gone, those people were yours all along. You just could not see them clearly, while the borrowed ones still filled up the room. That is the sorting. And I have 4 stories for you that I want you to hear before we have finished today. Stories that will make this real. Stay with me. Thomas was 79 when I met him. He had been married 44 years. His wife's name was Clara, and when Clara died, Thomas sat down in the same chair, in the same corner of the same room, and did not move from it, not really, for 2 years. Oh, he got up, he ate, he answered the door, but he was not in the room. Something essential had gone somewhere else, and he did not know how to call it back. In the first weeks after Clara passed, many people came. Casseroles, flowers, hands on his shoulder. And then, the way it always goes, the weeks became months, and the casseroles stopped, and the flowers stopped, and most of the people stopped too, because grief is uncomfortable to witness for long. And so they stopped coming. The loneliest moment of those 2 years, Thomas told me, was not the night Clara died. It was a Tuesday afternoon about 8 months in, when he looked at the calendar and realized no one had called in 11 days. Not because they were cruel, because they had run out of things to say. And they did not know how to stay without something to say. But there was a granddaughter. She was 9 years old. She had not run out of anything, because she had not yet learned to be afraid of grief, the way adults learn to be afraid of it. She came to visit him on a Saturday, sat down on the floor beside his chair, and after a while she looked up at him and said, "Grandpa, when are you going to come outside again? Grandma would want you to come outside." He got up, not because he was healed, not because the grief had lifted. He got up because a 9-year-old girl who loved him had said a true thing, and something in him still knew a true thing when he heard one. He never got over it, Thomas. He told me that plainly. He said, "I never got over Clara. I learned to carry her." And then he told me about a man named Frank, who had been his neighbor for 30 years. Frank started coming by on Saturday mornings about a year after Clara passed. He would knock, Thomas would answer, and Frank would say, "I am going to get breakfast." 2 men at a table, coffee going cold, not always saying anything. Frank never said the right thing, because Frank did not try to say the right thing. Frank just stayed. That is the sorting. Now I want to tell you about Earl and Doris. They were married 51 years, and for most of those years, they had a plan. Someday we will see the ocean. There was always a reason to wait. The children needed this, the money was needed for that, the timing was not right. They kept putting it into the someday drawer, the way people do. because there is always more time until there is not. Doris got the diagnosis on a Tuesday in October. It was not a minor one. Earl drove 14 hours. He rented a room 2 blocks from the water. And in the morning he carried her to the sand, because by then she could not walk well on her own. And he set her down where the water could reach her feet. She looked at the ocean for a long time without speaking. And then she said, "Why did we wait so long?" He did not have an answer. Earl told me he had thought about that question every single day since. He never found the answer that satisfied him, and I do not think he was supposed to. I think that question was meant to stay open. I think it is meant to stay open for all of us. Doris passed 4 months later. Earl told me those 3 days at the ocean were the best days of his whole life. Not the easiest, not the happiest, the best, because they were the most real. I have no resolution to give you for Earl. He was not all right, and I will not tell you he was. Some things do not resolve. Some things you just carry. What I will say is this: do not wait. Whatever it is you are waiting for, do not put it into the someday drawer if you can reach it now, because the drawer closes faster than you expect. Beatrice was 71 years old, and she had been trying to hold on to her daughter for 8 years. Her daughter had pulled away for reasons that were complicated, the way these things always are. And Beatrice had chased voicemails that went unreturned, birthday cards that received a text back once, and then nothing. She poured herself into the pulling for 8 years. She asked me once what she should do. I told her what I had been taught. Love is a light you leave on, not a rope you pull people in with. If you keep pulling, all they feel is the rope. They do not feel the light. And sometimes you have to stop pulling before they can feel the warmth. She did not want to hear that, but she sat with it, and eventually she stopped. Not because she stopped loving her daughter, but because she understood the pulling was not love. It was fear wearing love's clothing. She let the light stay on, and she stopped tugging on the rope. She found a quilting group at the community center, almost by accident. She found women there working with their hands, and Beatrice felt something she had not felt in 8 years. She felt like herself. 3 months later, her daughter called, not because Beatrice had done everything right, but because something in the true silence, the one that was not holding its breath anymore, had changed the air between them. I will not tell you silence is always the answer. I will not make you a promise the world did not make me. But I will tell you that Beatrice found her keepers when she stopped running toward what was running away. And then, from that more settled place, the door had room to open. Now I want to tell you about Harold. Harold was 72 when his wife passed, and he had spent his whole life being careful. Careful with money, careful with words, careful with what he allowed himself to want. After his wife was gone, something broke open in Harold. Not broke down, broke open. He learned to play guitar at 73. He was not good at it. He laughed and kept playing. He bought cheap paints and cheap canvases and painted badly. No training, no natural gift. And when the paintings were done, he hung them on his walls without apology. I have heard from people who knew Harold in his middle years, people who found this channel and recognized the story and wrote to me about it. And they said they could not reconcile the Harold of those last years with the Harold they had known. He was in every way more than he had permitted himself to be before. Those last years were the only years Harold was fully alive. Everything before was a rehearsal. And there was a neighbor, a man named Samuel, who had lived 2 houses down for 30 years. 30 years of nodding at each other over the fence, knowing each other's names, and almost nothing else. But when Harold's wife passed, Samuel knocked on the door, not with a casserole. He said, "I am going to rake your leaves. You don't have to come out. I just wanted you to know I was here." He raked the leaves and came back the next week, and the week after that. And gradually, over months, what had been 30 years of fence nodding became 2 old men at a kitchen table, Harold playing badly on his guitar, Samuel listening without complaint. It became real. There is a word for what Samuel was. Not a friend, not exactly. That word feels too ordinary for what he did. A friend is something you make when it is easy. What Samuel was required more than that. Samuel stayed when the staying cost him something. His time, his Saturday afternoons, his willingness to sit with a grieving man and a badly played guitar and offer nothing but his presence. Samuel was a keeper. A keeper is someone who stays when the staying costs something. Not someone who shows up when it is convenient. Not someone who loves you when loving you is easy. Someone who is still there when the scaffolding has come down and there is nothing in it for them but the fact of you. Harold had 30 years of proximity with Samuel and almost missed him entirely. Almost spent those last good years 2 houses away from a keeper, never knowing. The disappearing is not abandonment. The people who leave after 70 are not taking something from you. They are returning something that was always borrowed. What they reveal when they go is the outline of what was real all along. They reveal the keepers, the ones who are always there, sometimes 2 houses down, sometimes 30 years of fence nodding away, sometimes sitting in a quilting group you stumbled into by accident. The disappearing is not a wound. It is the land sorting what grows here from what was only passing through. I am an old man. I am not going to be here forever. I know that. And the thing that sits with me most, not death itself, but the possibility of the knowledge going quiet when I do. That is the thing that moved me to do something I had not done before. Almost everything I know was never written anywhere. It lived in my grandparents, in the way my grandmother held her hands around a tin cup in the morning, in the way my grandfather walked into a room and changed it without saying a word, in the stories I watched unfold over decades, at kitchen tables and beside fires in the evening. None of it was in any book. All of it was in people. And people end. So I sat down and wrote it down. 20 teachings, 4 parts, written the way I would speak it, plain, honest, the way I would speak to you if you were sitting across from me at the table. I called it the native way. I want to tell you about a woman named Pearl. She was 81 years old, and she had lost a son years before. She found one of the teachings on grief and the fire, on what the fire gives you when you sit near it. And she told me that after she read it, she stood at her kitchen sink and said her son's name out loud 3 times. And then she made his favorite dinner, the first time she had made it since he passed. I do not have words adequate to what that means to me. There is a man named Walter, 77 years old. He read it over 2 evenings. He said it was the first time anyone had explained to him why he had always felt things so deeply, that it was old blood doing what it was made to do. He started keeping an evening fire again, the way his grandmother had. Small thing, but he said it changed the evenings. And there is a man named Samuel, not Harold's neighbor, a different Samuel, 74 years old, who described himself as a hard man his whole life. He read the teaching on being water and not being rock, and then he called his grown son. He said it was the first real conversation they had had in years. He did not try to explain himself. He just listened. That was all. He just listened. It is an old man's teachings, written down. It cost less than 1 dinner you will not even remember eating. The link is in the description of this video. Now, before I let you go, a river does not grieve the water that leaves it. The river simply moves. It releases what was always passing through, and it deepens in the channels where the water runs true. It becomes itself more fully, not in spite of the releasing, but because of it. After 70, the releasing happens. Some of it is gentle and some of it is not, and almost none of it is timed the way you would have chosen. But what it leaves behind, if you let yourself look at what remains rather than keeping your eyes only on what went, what it leaves behind is the keepers. My grandmother used to say, the land recognizes its own. She meant it about belonging to a place, but I have come to understand it is also true of people. After enough years, after enough of the scaffolding comes down, the ones who belong to you become visible. Sometimes they were always nearby, just hidden by the crowd. Sometimes they knock on the door and offer to rake your leaves. Sometimes they are 9 years old and ask the question that gets you out of the chair. You cannot force the sorting. You cannot rush it or bargain with it. But you can refuse to call the contraction a failure when it is in fact a clarification of who was always real. My grandfather used to say, fire is the oldest gift. When you sit near it, you are sitting near the beginning of everything. I light my fire in the evenings the same way he lit his, not because the house needs it, but because I need what the fire gives, the settling, the belonging. And some evenings I sit by it and I think of all the keepers I have had in my life. My grandmother in the cold mornings with her tin cup. My grandfather with his stillness that changed a room. Thomas's granddaughter and the 9 words that got him out of the chair. Beatrice's women at the quilting table. Harold with his terrible paintings, and Samuel who raked the leaves without being asked.